In the dead of night, the living room light still on. She, 7 months pregnant, hears muffled laughter behind the thin door. In the living room, he speaks softly with another woman. She's too exhausted to react. Sitting on the bed, she holds the ultrasound against her chest as she listens to the plan to have her declared unfit and lose her child before birth. Barefoot, she gathers her documents, puts on worn shoes, and slowly opens the back door. The lawn is wet. Cold bites. The street is deserted. When she walks through the gate, the two are still laughing, and she doesn't look back. Do you enjoy intense, chaotic, and emotionally tense stories? Then subscribe now so you don't miss a single one. Thank you. Now back to our pre-dawn hours stretched over the an unpromising curtain. In the bedroom, Marina rested on her side, her swollen belly pressing against the old mattress that creaked with every movement. Sleep hadn't come easily for weeks. Her pregnancy was already in its 7th month, and every position felt wrong. Every breath carried the weight of accumulated fatigue. Her back ached constantly. Her swollen feet throbbed even at rest. But none of this compared to the emptiness she felt when Marcelo passed by her without looking, as if she were just another piece of furniture in the house. Then she heard it. Low voices coming from the living room, suppressed laughter, as if sharing a complicit secret. Marina immediately recognized Marcelo's voice, her husband, but there was another one there, feminine, soft, too intimate for that hour. Her heart tightened. It wasn't paranoia. They weren't voices from the forgotten television left on. It was real. It was deliberate. It was a presence that shouldn't be there. She held her breath, trying to catch the words through the walls. The sound was muffled, but clear enough for each syllable to penetrate the thin wooden door. "She won't have any way to contest it," Marcelo said, that tone of someone solving a technical problem. Cold, calculated. "The documents are almost ready. Just 1 more week." "What if she gets suspicious?" the other voice. Slight hesitation. "She's too exhausted to think. Look at her. She can barely get out of bed. By the time she realizes, it'll already be done. They'll declare her unfit. Simple as that." Then his low laugh, followed by her murmuring approval. Marina felt the air escape from her lungs as if someone had pressed on her chest. It wasn't just betrayal, something worse. A meticulous, coldly calculated plan, executed while she slept, while she worried only about keeping the pregnancy stable, about not losing the baby she already felt moving inside her. Her hands trembled as she clutched. She couldn't confront them, not now. If she did, they would have time to adjust the plan, to anticipate her moves, to make everything irreversible before she could react. She needed to understand first, gather evidence, think clearly. But fear was faster than reason. If they were planning to remove her from the picture, how much time did she have left? Hours. Slowly, with measured movements, she slid her legs out of bed. The cold floor was a cruel reminder of reality. She was barefoot, vulnerable, alone in a house that had ceased to be a refuge. Every movement had to be silent. She opened the drawer where she kept her documents, birth certificate, ID card, her public health ID, and that small envelope with the ultrasound images. The baby's first photo, taken 3 weeks earlier, one could see the delicate profile, fingers. She held the image against her chest for a moment, as if it were an amulet capable of protecting them both. Then she stuffed everything into a small fabric bag she used to take to the market. An old coat hung behind the door, a pair of worn-out shoes, with the sole almost smooth, nothing more. There was no time to choose better, to think of comfort or dignity. There was only the survival instinct pulsing louder than any other thought. The back door creaked when she opened it, but the sound of voices in the living room, now louder, more confident, muffled any noise. Marina stepped out into the dark yard, treading carefully on the dew-wet grass. Hands trembled. The night's cold, bitter skin through the thin coat. The street was empty. No car, no witnesses. Only the wind blowing through the trees and the distant sound of a dog barking. She walked. She didn't know where to go, but she knew that staying would be to die slowly, would be to accept the version others were writing for her life. Something new in that moment, something she had never felt before. It was fear, it was decision, a spark that began to burn, transforming despair into movement, paralysis into action. Bumba. Procedures exist to serve people. I heard that phrase once, in a hospital corridor, from the mouth of a tired nurse who had patiently attended her request when Marina needed help filling out complicated forms. At the time, it seemed just a polite phrase, part of institutional training. Now it echoed like a distant cry. Procedures, protocols, papers. They were being used against her, transformed into weapons of exclusion, but papers could also save her. If she could prove what she had heard, if she could dismantle the machine before it completely crushed her. She walked for over an hour, crossing empty streets, passing by closed shops with rusted grates, through deserted parks where homeless people slept under cardboard. Her back ached, but stopping would mean being found, and being found would mean the end. When the sky began to lighten, she spotted an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial park. The doors were ajar. There were marks of old bonfires on the concrete floor. She entered cautiously, checking if no one was there. The place smelled of mold and old wood, but it was dry. It was hidden. There, leaning against a cold wall, Marina finally allowed herself to cry, not out of despair, but understanding. She understood, that night, that the world was not inherently fair. Justice needed to be built, defended, sometimes wrested by force from systems that preferred silence to conflict, and she had decided that she would not be silenced. The news began to circulate the following morning, spreading through social media with the characteristic speed of well-constructed scandals. Pregnant woman disappears, leaving confused letter, the first comments read, accompanied by speculations about emotional instability and possible breakdown. Marcelo had been quick, efficient, meticulous. He had activated strategic acquaintances, local journalists, digital influencers, even a city council member with whom he maintained business relations. He spread a version that absolved him of any guilt, painting himself as a concerned husband, a victim of tragic circumstances. He was disoriented by pregnancy, emotionally unstable due to hormones, incapable of making rational decisions without medical supervision. The narrative gained strength with each repetition, each share, each sympathetic comment directed at him. Marina followed everything from an improbable place, that abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where she had found shelter thanks to the unexpected kindness of an elderly woman who collected discarded wood to sell. Ms. Cecilia was over 70, with white hair tied in a loose bun, hands calloused from a lifetime of hard work, and eyes that seemed to have seen many similar stories. She hadn't asked questions, she had only offered water in an old plastic bottle, tattered but clean blanket, and respectful silence. But on the second day, when Marina began to recount her story in nervous fragments, interrupted by long pauses and frightened glances at the warehouse door, Miss Cecilia seemed to recognize something painfully familiar. "Or," she said, her eyes fixed on the peeling wall, as if projecting old memories there. Not exactly the same, but similar. Powerful man, troublesome woman, disappearing papers, witnesses who changed their story overnight. And what happened to her? Miss Cecilia, when she did, her voice carried a weight that only decades of accumulated injustice can. She lost everything because she couldn't prove anything in time, because no one wanted to listen to her, because his word was worth more than her truth. Anguish was physical, palpable, as if the air was lacking and the warehouse walls were closing in. But Ms. Cecilia continued, now with a different tone, not of defeat, but of determination. But you can still prove it, if you know where to look, if you act fast, if you don't give up when it seems impossible. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Marcelo consolidated his position with the efficiency of someone who has played chess for years. He worked at a consulting firm that maintained lucrative contracts with public and private institutions, hospitals, clinics, regulatory bodies. His network of contacts was extensive and well cultivated. Strategic lunches, favors exchanged, privileged information shared in discreet conversations. His mistress, Veronica, held a strategic administrative position in a mental health clinic. There, she had unrestricted access to electronic medical records, medical reports, and the digital signatures of professionals. And she was using all of this to build a false dossier, a clinical narrative that would paint Marina as a person incapable of caring for herself, let alone a child. The plan was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Declare Marina mentally incapacitated, obtain a preventive court order for the protection of the unborn child, and assume custody of the baby even before birth. All within the law, or at least with a convincing appearance of legality. Protocol after protocol, stamp after stamp, signature after signature. But there was a micro fissure in the plan, still invisible but present. A crack that grew silently. A clinic employee, Rodrigo, was a newcomer, only 6 months on the job, and had learned to turn a blind eye to irregularities the way veterans did. He had noticed that documents were being altered outside standard protocol, digital signatures inserted without the patient's physical presence, appointments recorded on impossible dates, dates manipulated retroactively. When he questioned Veronica about the inconsistencies, she stared at him with that mixture of condescension and veiled threat that people in positions of power master. "It's an urgent procedure approved by the board of directors," she said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Nay, special cases require administrative flexibility. You'll understand this better when you have more experience." But Rodrigo knew the protocols. He had studied them obsessively during training, and that didn't add up. It wasn't flexibility. It was manipulation. He didn't know yet, but he was about to become the link that would change everything. Marina, hidden and without resources, needed to act, but didn't know how. Ms. Cecilia suggested she try to contact someone trustworthy, a friend, a family member, anyone who could help. But Marina realized, with growing bitterness, that everyone around her had been convinced by Marcelo's version. He controlled the narrative with mastery. She was just a fleeting shadow, a confused woman who had abandoned her home. It was then that Mrs. Cecilia mentioned a name, almost as if talking to her. "I know someone who works with whistleblowing. An independent journalist. She covers cases of institutional abuse. If you have concrete evidence, she can help. But it has to be solid. It has to be irrefutable." "But I don't have evidence. I only heard the conversation. It's my word against his." "Then you need to get evidence. Documents, recordings, witnesses, anything that transforms your word into evidence." And that's how Marina began to understand the real dimension of the challenge. The escape was just the first step. Physical survival was just the beginning. The real battle would be against the system that allowed people like Marcelo to manipulate institutions for their own benefit, transforming procedures into instruments of oppression. The invisible clock began to tick. In 6 days, the falsified document would be filed. In 6 days, she would legally cease to exist as a mother even before giving birth. Rodrigo couldn't sleep. Those documents haunted him even when he closed his eyes. Something in them deeply disturbed him, not just as a professional, but as a human being. He returned to the clinic after hours, using his limited employee access to review the digital files in the system. The computer room was empty, illuminated only by the bluish light of the monitor. Fingers trembled slightly as he typed. When he compared the most recent report with earlier records stored in system backups, he noticed glaring inconsistencies that any serious audit would identify. Chronologically impossible overlapping dates, digital signatures that did not match known biometric patterns. Still, a patient who had never been physically present during the supposedly conducted appointments. The reception entry records simply did not exist. He printed a copy of the original report the moment before the alterations, dated and signed, all metadata preserved. Then he carefully hid the document in his backpack, books and notebooks, and left before the night guard saw him and asked inconvenient questions. But to whom should he deliver that? He knew that Veronica had internal protection, connections with the board. Reporting directly through official channels could cost him his job or something worse. He had already heard stories about employees who questioned irregularities and were fired for cultural incompatibility. It was then that he heard about the case while browsing social media on that sleepless night. On social media, an anonymous profile had published a desperate appeal. If anyone knows of irregularities involving false medical reports, report them. Lives are at risk. A pregnant woman is being persecuted by a corrupt system. The profile had no photo, no identification, but the IP traced by the most curious indicated a region near the industrial warehouse where Marina was hiding. Rodrigo hesitated for hours. It would be risky, it could be a trap, it could be paranoia, but upon rereading the document he held, seeing the false signatures, the manipulated dates, he realized that not acting would be complicity. It would be allowing injustice to be completed. He sent an encrypted message to the profile. I have evidence. Original documents. Where can I meet her safely? The answer came 3 hours later, in the dead of night. Tomorrow, public library, table at the back, reference section, 3 p.m. sharp. I'm alone. Marina was nervous when Mrs. Cecilia showed her the message. She didn't know if she could trust someone who identified himself only as R. It could be Marcelo's trap. It could be someone trying to locate her to turn her in. Miss. Cecilia offered to accompany her, but staying at a distance, observing, if it's a trap, you won't go alone. I'll be there. The next day, they arrived at the library half an hour before the scheduled time. Marina wore a scarf covering part of her face, dark glasses even inside the building. She constantly looked in all directions, as if at any moment someone could recognize her and shout her name. Her hands were sweating, her heart was pounding. When Rodrigo appeared, carrying an old backpack and looking around with evident nervousness, he seemed as scared as she was. He sat at the indicated table, took a deep breath, and without many introductory words, opened his backpack and took out a discreet folder. This here, he said in a low, almost whispering, pointing to the carefully preserved document, is the original report. Before any alteration, your fake digital signature is here, on this line. Compare it with this other document, which was issued later with the modifications. Marina took the papers with trembling hands. She read line by line. She saw her own name associated with psychiatric diagnoses she had never received: severe bipolar disorder, recurrent psychotic episodes, progressive cognitive impairment. She saw appointments that never happened, recorded on days when she was working or at home. She saw a completely distorted version of herself, meticulously constructed to justify her exclusion, her legal destruction. She felt rage, deep, burning, transformative, and for the first time in weeks, she also felt real hope. Is this enough to prove they are lying? Yes. The system's metadata doesn't lie. The inconsistencies are evident, but it will only work if you present it before an official board, an authority with decision-making power. Otherwise, they'll simply say it's just a paper without context, an unverified claim. When is the next board meeting? Rodrigo checked his phone, verifying public information. In 2 days, 48 hours. If you miss that deadline, the false document will be officially filed and registered. After that, reversing it will be infinitely more difficult. 2 days? 48 hours. Marina clutched the papers tightly, as if they were the last piece of an impossible puzzle, the only weapon against an army. I'll be there. I don't know how, but I will. Miss Cecilia, who had listened to everything in respectful silence, keeping her distance but attentive, Finally approached and spoke with that wisdom that only decades of life teach. You'll need more than that. You'll need witnesses, your own voice, courage to expose yourself, because they will try to destroy your credibility. They will say you're crazy, that you're lying, that you forged the documents. Marina looked at her, then at Rodrigo, then at the papers in her hands. A decision crystallized in her mind. Then I'll record everything. I'll tell the whole story from beginning to end, with names, surnames, and evidence, even if it exposes me completely, even if it makes me a target. Rodrigo hesitated, concerned about the consequences. If you do this publicly, they will mobilize all resources to try to destroy your image, your credibility. They will use everything against you. Marina took a deep breath. The decision was made. Let them try. A lie doesn't stand up to the truth when there's physical evidence, when there's courage to name what's wrong. And so, in that quiet library where students prepared for exams and elderly people read newspapers, the real turning point began. It was no longer just a woman fleeing an impossible situation. It was a woman determined to dismantle a system, to name injustice, to transform her individual pain into collective reform. The video was recorded the following night, in the warehouse where Marina was hiding, in various conditions but with dignity preserved. Ms. Cecilia held the cell phone with steady hands while Marina, sitting on an old but clean crate, narrated everything with surprising clarity. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She didn't apologize for existing. She spoke with methodically constructed clarity. She mentioned full names. She described the plan in detail. She showed the baby's ultrasound, pointing to the small but clear image. And, in the end, she held up the document Rodrigo had given her, pointing to the false signatures, to the impossible dates, to the phantom appointments. Procedures exist to serve people, not to destroy them, not to silence them, not to transform institutions into instruments of oppression. The phrase came out with force, like a manifesto, like a conviction rooted not only in personal experience, but in a structural understanding of what was wrong. The video was published on an alternative whistleblowing platform specialized in institutional abuses. In the first hours, it had few accesses, only dozens of views. But slowly, it began to. Independent journalists shared it. Human rights advocates commented. Organizations supporting victims of institutional violence reposted it. In 12 hours, the video had thousands of views. In 24 hours, tens of thousands. Marcello reacted with the speed and violence characteristic of someone who feels the ground crumbling beneath their feet. He hired the best lawyers his resources could buy to allege defamation, slander, and breach of privacy. Veronica issued an official statement through the clinic, categorically denying any irregularity, claiming it was an administrative misunderstanding by an inexperienced employee. The institution tried to minimize the case publicly, saying it was conducting a routine internal audit. The public was no longer naive. Comments on social media began to proliferate. What about the documents? Why don't they explain the fake signatures? If it's a simple misunderstanding, why don't they open an independent external investigation? How many other women were silenced like this before her? Pressure grew exponentially. Rights advocacy groups contacted Marina offering legal support. Investigative journalists began digging for similar stories involving the same clinic. The State Health Council, pressured by public repercussions, convened an extraordinary meeting to formally investigate the allegations. Marina was officially called to testify under protection. Marcello was also subpoenaed, as was Veronica. Rodrigo was summoned as a technical witness. On the day of the hearing, the room was full. Marina arrived accompanied by Mrs. Cecilia, Rodrigo, and a volunteer lawyer from a human rights organization. Simple but dignified clothes, her belly now in its 8th month, her movements slower but her posture firm. She seemed physically fragile, but there was a silent strength in her presence. Marcello, on the other hand, well-cut suit, a discreet, defensive lawyers by his side, an expression of someone who completely controlled the situation. He began his testimony skillfully trying to invert the narrative, using well-rehearsed rhetorical techniques. Members of the council, this is a tragic situation for the entire family. My wife, unfortunately, is emotionally distressed by the pregnancy. The hormones, the stress, the anxiety, all of this created an elaborate fantasy to justify erratic behavior. I am here not to accuse her, but to protect her, to protect needs treatment, not public exposure. His voice sounded almost paternal, convincing. But when Marina presented the original document to the council, handing physical and digital copies to each member, the atmosphere in the room changed perceptibly. Council members carefully examined signatures. They meticulously compared dates. They immediately requested the complete digital records of the clinic, including system access logs. Veronica was called to explain the technical inconsistencies. She tried to maintain her composure, alleging automatic system error, temporary failure in the management software. But when asked why multiple reports from different patients had been altered in the same period, all by her, all following similar modification patterns, she couldn't answer convincingly. Sweat began to appear on her forehead. Rodrigo was summoned as a specialized technical witness. He presented a forensic analysis of the metadata, demonstrating step-by-step how the alterations were made, at what times, using which credentials. He confirmed the irregularities with technical but accessible language. He presented copies of backup records that proved deliberate and systematic manipulation. The council president, a veteran doctor with decades of institutional experience, paused long and significantly. He looked at Marcelo, then at Veronica, then, slowly, a voice that echoed, "When institutions are used as tools of abuse, they fundamentally betray their reason for existence. Protocols become weapons against those they should protect. It's necessary to review not just individual cases, but entire structures. This case is not just about one specific woman. It's about how many others were silenced before her. It's about how many more will be silenced if we don't act now." There was a dense silence, laden with meaning. "Procedures exist to serve people," the president repeated, echoing Marina's words, "not to serve shady interests, not to protect abusers, not to silence victims." He turned to the other council members. "I propose not only the immediate invalidation of all altered documents, but a complete audit of the last 5 years of this institution's records. How many other similar cases exist? How many other people have been harmed?" The vote was unanimous. The formal decision came the following week. After detailed technical analysis, all alterations to the reports were officially annulled. Veronica was immediately suspended and would face criminal charges for document fraud, ideological falsehood, and abuse of power. Marcelo lost any legal claim to custody or control over Marina or the baby. Marina was declared legally competent, free of any restrictions, with all her rights fully restored. But the legal victory was only part of the story. The true change would need to come from deeper transformations. The baby was born 3 weeks after the council decision, on a clear autumn morning. A healthy boy with dark eyes inherited from his mother and clenched fists from the very as if he already arrived in the world ready. Marina held him for the first time in a simple but clean public maternity ward, surrounded by people who had become more than allies. It was Cecilia, who held her free hand with tenderness, and Rodrigo, who watched from the door with a discreet smile, both transformed into chosen family. "He will grow up knowing the truth," Marina said. She cradled her son in her arms, feeling the small but significant weight of that life. "He will know that dignity is not negotiable. He will know that procedures that do not serve people need to be changed." Her story quickly became a symbol, spreading beyond local borders. Organizations supporting victims of institutional violence began to use her case as a fundamental example of possible resistance, of courage that transforms structures. New laws were proposed in legislative assemblies to specifically curb the manipulation of medical reports. Cross-verification protocols were reinforced in public and private clinics and hospitals. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented. Marcello faced multiple civil and criminal lawsuits, losing not only his professional reputation but valuable contracts and connections he had spent years building. Veronica was fired, heavily fined, and permanently barred from working in sectors related to health or sensitive data management. Rodrigo, on the other hand, received formal institutional protection as a good-faith whistleblower, was promoted in another reputable institution that valued integrity, and became a voluntary consultant for protocol reforms. But the greater impact was invisible to the eyes, immaterial but profoundly real. Other women who had gone through similar situations, silenced, discredited, erased, began to seek help, encouraged by the example. Some brought evidence they had hidden for years, fearing exposure. Others, just painful accounts, testimonies that finally needed to be heard. Marina received them, all of them, without exception, and always said the same thing. Procedures exist to serve people. If they don't serve you, if they are used against you, then they are not fair. And justice begins when someone finds the courage not to be silent. But you don't have to do it alone. She methodically transformed her personal pain into a collective purpose. She began to work formally with an established organization that guided victims of institutional manipulation, teaching them to identify early signs of abuse of power, to adequately collect and preserve evidence, to seek legal recourse before it was too late. She conducted workshops, offered consulting, shared her story repeatedly, each narration a small victory against oblivion. The baby's ultrasound, that first image she had carried during her desperate escape, carefully framed and hung on the wall of her new home. Modest but safe, not as a remembrance of suffering overcome, but as a permanent symbol of conscious choice. The choice to flee when staying would mean destruction. The choice to fight when it would be easier to accept. The choice not to passively accept the version others wanted to impose on her life. 3 years after her son's birth, Marina was invited to speak as a keynote speaker at a national conference on human rights and necessary institutional reforms. She walked onto the large stage with her son beside her, now a curious 3-year-old boy who explored every corner of the auditorium with bright eyes and incessant questions. She began her speech like this, to an audience of hundreds. No one should have to flee their home pregnant in the dead of night to prove they deserve basic dignity. No one should have to record a desperate video for someone to believe their word. No one should have to fight judicially just to maintain the right to fully exist. But as long as institutions are systematically used to silence those who inconvenience them, someone will have to break the initial silence. And when that happens, we must be collectively ready to listen, to act, to transform individual cases into structural reforms. The room applauded for a long time, standing, but Marina knew deeply that applause alone didn't change structures. Only sustained concrete actions changed them. Only permanent vigilance changed them. Only a collective refusal to accept normalized injustice changed them. And she had decided to dedicate her life to being that act. Vigilance that refused. Ms. Cecilia, watching from the audience amidst discreet tears of pride, smiled widely. Rodrigo, beside her, quickly wiped his eyes. Both knew that that victory was not final, not complete, not definitive. It was just an important chapter in a much longer struggle, but it was a chapter written with genuine courage, with proven truth, with procedures finally used to serve people, and that, in itself, was deeply worth every step taken in the cold pre-dawn, every document preserved, every moment of fear transformed into action. You who read this story to the end, If one day you find an institutional door closed before you, remember that opening doors begins by courageously refusing the version they want you to accept without questioning. The truth doesn't always shout, but it exists silently, persistently, inevitably, and resisting, even when it seems impossible, is often the greatest act of justice one can perform for oneself and for all who will come after.